Now, the process of creating seams is tricky because two things can go wrong that will have a severe impact on the overall appearance of the installation. Number one, if the grain is not properly aligned, the seam will be visible and the turf area will not look like a coherent whole. And number two, if there is a gap or an overlap, or if the two edges of the turf area aren't properly lined up, there can be a bunching or bare spots and it won't wear well. In order to avoid these problems, seaming should be done in the following way. First, work along straight edges and make sure that the grain is going in the proper direction. If you look on the underside of the turf, you will see lines that look like stitching. You will need to align the seam in the direction of this stitching. To prepare the two pieces of material for seaming, the first thing to do is to cut the edge in the proper location for the seam. When preparing to cut the material, you will need to be looking at two pieces of turf, one on your left and the other piece at your right. Begin on the left side. Roll over the edge and cut the seam along the outside edge of the stitching so that there is no excess backing on the seam side of the cut. Once you've completed the cutting on this side, turn to the section of turf on your right. On this side of the turf, you will be cutting along the inside edge of the stitching so that there is the same amount of backing as there is between the two rows of stitching on the seam side of the cut. This means that on one side of the seam there is no extra backing. On the other side of the seam, the backing creates the interval standard for the turf. So, when the two sides are matched together along the seam, there is no interruption in the regular distance between rows of stitching. This will ensure that the spacing of the rows of grass blades along the seam is exactly the same as the spacing of the rows of grass blades throughout the rest of the turf, preventing unevenness, bunching, or other irregularities along the seam. If you simply eyeball the distance and try to cut halfway between the rows, you are more than likely to get small inconsistencies in the backing distance that will cause the fabric not to line up properly, and that will cause wrinkles or bunching in the grass. Once the turf is cut and ready to be seamed, line up the two pieces being seamed together so that the edges of the turf precisely match each other and are smoothed out to cover the desired turf area. When the two sides of the seam are in place, secure each side by driving turf spikes approximately 6 inches from the seam edge, placing them every 6 to 8 inches along the seam. This secures the turf in place, so you can fold back the turf edges along the seam, hold them in place with spikes, and lay down the seam tape between them. Connecting the two pieces of turf with seam tape is important because it prevents uneven wear and potential weed growth along the seam. Pour the seam glue onto the strip of seam tape and then spread it evenly over the width of the tape. A seam staple wrapped with duct tape serves as an inexpensive glue spreader. Now, be sure not to get any glue or anything else that has touched the glue come into contact with the grass blades. Simply fold the turf back over the seam tape and secure the seam in place with square seaming staples. When inserting the staples, use other staples or turf spikes to fold back the grass blades and ensure that none get bent over and caught underneath the staple. In some situations, you may need to cut and seam perpendicular to the stitch rows on the back of the turf. This is called a butt seam. You will follow the same guidelines as a regular seam, but instead of cutting along the stitching, you will cut between the stitches on the back of the turf. When butting the turf up to the adjacent turf section, align the stitch rows so that the rows continue through the seam so the seam remains hidden. We went over a lot there, but let's review. When you have aligned the pieces of turf to be seamed, begin by cutting the turf on either side of the seam. Cut one side on the outside edge of the stitching and the other on the inside edge. Line up the turf, secure with turf spikes, and roll it back. Lay down the seam tape and spread the seam glue. Fold the turf into place and secure it with staple.